Hello, and welcome to the Alliance Francaise of Metro Miami's very first author interview, connected with our very first book club meeting. The author is Katherine Chen, whose book, Joan, a novel, was the subject of our first readers gathering, which took place in Miami exactly a week ago. The book was also the winner of the American Library in Paris's annual book prize in 2023. That award goes to an outstanding new work of literature that celebrates France, its culture, and its history, a mission not unlike that of the Alliance Francaise. My name is Anne Morrison, and I'm a member of the American Library in Paris, as well as the Alliance Francaise of Metro Miami. Katherine Chen is not only an award-winning author, she is also a prolific critic and essayist whose works have been published in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times Book Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and many more. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, Anne. Thank you for the intro.
Well, thank you for being here. Let's start with the subject of the book. That's novel approach. Joan of Arc, a woman whose story has been told in literally thousands of books and dozens of films. So why Joan and why now?
I think the why behind any book is ultimately always a personal one. So to undertake a book project is almost always a pretty significant investment, both in terms of time and energy. Especially if you don't know what the outcome is going to be. That is, there's no guarantee that it's going to see the light of day or that it's going to be published. So I think the why behind Joan is no different for me. A number of years ago, I knew someone who remarked to me just very casually over the phone that novels are always written by our past selves. And for some reason, that line really stayed with me. So I completely agree with that. I don't think in my current state I would be able to write the version of Joan that I did at this moment. I think my approach to the same historical figure would probably be very different. And maybe I wouldn't even write on Joan in terms of where my interests lie at the present and sort of the trajectory that I imagine for what I hope to be my career. But in the state of mind that I was in then, when I was working on the book, the Joan that ultimately came out on the pages made a lot of sense. So, I think books are also rather like lovers in the way that I think you will find the right book at the right time. Just like the right subject will find you at the right time. And it's usually let's say, the right lover that materializes in that phase of your life that you're in. Or if you don't realize it then you might realize it looking back. And, books are no different in that sense. So the way Joan worked was a number of years before I started working on a book project, and I had impulsively purchased a biography of Joan at a bookstore, like a local Barnes and Noble, for no other reason than that it was a bright and shiny cover with an image of, a female warrior on the cover on the dust jacket. And like so many people who go to bookstores and buy books, I never read what I purchased. And I think that's such a remarkable phenomenon in book buying, by the way. And I wonder if that would actually, my brain is kind of thinking of whether that would warrant a longer piece about this trend of buying books one never reads and what that represents about our culture or society as a whole, and then sort of returning to those books that one bought years ago. And anyway, so I purchased this biography, and certain things had occurred in my life, which is that I had been let go from my latest job. So I didn't have health insurance, I didn't have benefits, and I had a set amount in my bank that I knew would have to go towards living expenses such as rent and so forth. And overall, it was just an incredibly low period in my life. And I was actually thinking about this before the interview that but at this point in my life, I've been let go 4 times, nearly five. And in all of those instances, there was this trend of insubordination on my part, of not wanting to listen to other people's commands, of not wishing to endure an existence within a confined space, be that literally in an office or figuratively, as in dependent upon someone else's goodwill, to receive a paycheck. So I think those were the various ingredients that went into the melting pot, so to speak, that ultimately resulted in the version of Joan that I created at the time versus, George Bernard Shaw's Joan, which is a very different Joan, or Mark Twain's Joan, which is an even more different Joan, or Dreyer's Joan from the famous film. Um, so it was the right historical figure for me to write on at the time. And I think there is something to be said too about approaching a creative project with no expectations, because years after I purchased the biography of Joan, I picked up that book again, read it from cover to cover, and thought that I would write about her only if something clicked. And thankfully, it did. Yeah.
What in Joan and it resonated with you at that time in your life? The insubordination, the independence, the feminism.
Yeah, I think it was all of those things. And I think there was a fair amount of, if I may be frank, egotism that goes into any kind of artistic slash creative endeavor, which is um, when you think that maybe no author slash creator slash artist has really done justice to a figure who comes to mean a lot to you, like Joan of Arc did for me. So when I read Mark Twain's novel, I admit that I didn't think much of it. And I
I don't think anyone, only Mark Twain thought a lot of it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think he mentioned that it might have been his favorite novel, and he certainly spent years in the archives. I mean, good for him that doing so much, research on Joan of Arc. But likewise with George Bernard Shaw's Joan, the play, which I think secured him the Nobel Prize. I thought that the preface of that play was ultimately more interesting than the play itself. I thought that the preface of Shaw's play on Joan of Arc was actually very impressive and forward thinking in a sense. He makes Joan to be a kind of savant, like genius like figure, and that person that he writes about in his preface of all places is a more fully fleshed out character than the one that's portrayed, I think, on the stage. So I think in that sense, I thought this is such a elusive character, and we know that she existed in history. So one line that I really liked from Mary Gordon's short biography on Joan of Arc is that she said that whereas characters like, and I'm paraphrasing, so whereas characters like Robin Hood and King Arthur, they existed, in legend, Joan lives in history. So we have this real life character, and we know, she lived from 1412 to 1431. And always I'm astonished too by just the short duration of her life and the fact that, her life is so end heavy in the sense that the action doesn't really begin until 1429. There was something that resonated with me in terms of one, you're right, the insubordination, two, the sort of ruthlessness and heedlessness with which she approached life, and the lessons we can extract from that. And three, I would, going back to the creative sense, the challenge of trying to translate such a character effectively onto the page.
Well, I think you did a fabulous job, but let's talk more. You don't start with Joan as the principal character. You start really with a fight between little boys from neighboring villages, a fight that ends very badly with the death of one little boy named Guillaume. Why did you start there?
Well, initially, when I wrote the first draft of the book, that ended up being well over 200,000 words. That wasn't the first scene. I think that scene only came much later, sort of in concurrently with certain other things that were happening in my life. And it unfolded because sometimes when you do research, it's really not the main thing or the main plot. such as like in Joan's case, maybe the Siege of Orleans or something like that. It's not something major like that that will be a watershed moment in one's research for a historical novel. It might be instead a seemingly innocuous line, like the fact that Joan recollects from her youth seeing injured boys returning to the village. And she remembers that they were bruised, that they were, maybe superficially wounded from these rock fights with a neighboring village. And it's, something that's just a phrase, which is a line from, her trial record, like a transcript line, that will really get me thinking. And then that spins out a whole scene that ends up taking up a lot of significance in the book. So it's really interesting in that sense, when you're crafting a historical novel, that you're taking sort of marginal moments in history and making them more important than perhaps they were, instead of focusing or fixating on the things that would be considered more important historically, such as major battles and so forth.
Well, the story Guillaume, um, there's an echo of Guillaume further on in the book too. She
Right.
thinks of him during battle scenes. Is she fighting for him? And then there are other scenes as well. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think the most obvious echo of that scene is later, and this was also based on a historical anecdote that also seemed quite marginal. And I don't think many people would know this when they just think of Joan of Arc off the top of their heads, which is that historically, at the conclusion of the Battle of Patay, which was a major victory for the French, Joan, she was at the not the deathbed, but she cradled the head of an English soldier, and basically, I think prayed with him as he died. And I thought that that was very moving in a sense, that and she seemed to be genuinely moved by the death that she witnessed as part of war, which is an inevitable part of war. So I think there was a very deliberate through line in that sense, with the death of the child named Guillaume at the beginning of the novel, and then later the death of the English soldier named William, which is obviously, the English equivalent of that name, and showing how not only that death is universal, but the human cost on both sides. Um, and I think too, I mentioned that in the battles that Joan engaged in, she almost saw them as kind of shadow images of the initial rock fight that appears at the beginning of the novel. And so I think I was maybe making a point now that I look back about how violence is entrenched from youth when you're growing up in an environment that only knows war. I think at the time that the book begins, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 1422. I think that the Hundred Years' War was already going on for like 80 something
Yeah,
years.
yeah.
Yeah, 80, 85 years. And so I'm assuming that, when a country has been entrenched in war on and off for so long, that it really almost implants itself in a way of living. And I think I was attempting to demonstrate that with the initial scene.
Yeah, violence is definitely permeates the book, warfare, violence, and even in Joan's own upbringing. Her father was a very violent person, particularly towards Joan. Can you talk more about him and their relationship?
Well, I think again, with the father is such an interesting character because the reason that I made him the way he is in the book is it was really just probably the one anecdote that actually some number of people know about Joan of Arc's father, which is that he had a prophetic dream of Joan going off to war, and but in the dream he assumes that she's a camp follower, um, sort of mingling with the soldiers. And he says that, if this comes to fruition, he will have her drowned, instead of disgracing the family. And I think that it was reading that story, which is perhaps apocryphal or perhaps based in history, that made me render him into a more violent figure who doesn't understand Joan. So there's that paradox of his not understanding Joan and not really knowing, how to deal with her almost as, a child, but also the fact that they are incredibly alike in other ways. So there's this, penchant for violence, on Joan's side, except she's more rooted in, charity and benevolence. She doesn't necessarily want violence or to inflict cruelty. That's not her purpose. But there is at the same time this like overlapping, these overlapping traits between the two characters. And they're both incredibly intelligent and they're both leaders in their own way. And they're savvy and I think Joan's father was quite accomplished historically and probably eloquent. And so it's this idea that a lot of the traits have been, perhaps in the book that is, so a lot of the traits have been passed on from father to daughter, and yet it's kind of like oil and water as well. They're not able to, become allies.
Well, just for the record, our book group didn't like the father at all. So
Right.
there were no kind words for him at all. However, the sister, Katherine, is another very important person in the book. And the relationship between Katherine and Joan is a sisterly relationship, but probably even more than that. Can you talk about Katherine and her importance in the story?
I think Catherine ultimately plays two roles in the book, which is one, she's Joan's, um, she's Joan's confidant and best friend, certainly, but she also represents a kind of almost fairy tale goodness that I think I'm stating has no place in a world like the one that Joan exists in. So I think my point that I was trying to convey is that there is no space for that kind of pure, almost princess like, you know, um, belief in the goodness of others, or that kind of, um, benevolence, which I think Catherine represents. And with Joan, so there's that, and also too, Catherine, provided a very convenient conduit for how to treat the visions in the book. So in historically, Joan is visited by Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, and I made a lot out of the fact that there's an overlap between Saint Catherine and the name of Saint Catherine, and which is based on Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Catherine, her sister's name. So it's almost like the sister Catherine took the place of Saint Catherine, um, in the book, in terms of, how she comes to, her relationship with the saint.
Well, Catherine dies tragically, and that's another, I think, turning point in the book. Um, could you talk about the aftermath of her death?
Yeah, I think yeah, I think again that heralds back to my point about, goodness, or that kind of pure, uncynical, unfiltered goodness having no place in a world that is totally steeped in violence and war. Um, and so Catherine, the sister, is becomes kind of a martyr in that sense, a literal victim. And I wanted something more in Joan's story in the novel than a saint coming to visit her and sort of instruct her to simply follow instructions, which is, historically, the way that things play out. It's that she receives visions, and then she goes from like A to B to C. And I wanted there to be more of a human or personal motivation for Joan in the novel, which is obviously one of those is certainly the death of her sister, which is almost as close to home as you can get. And I think
Mhm.
when something that tragic and traumatic happens, I wanted it to also put into perspective the efficacy of certain things that Joan witnesses, like prayer, because her mother is extremely religious in the book, and so I wanted that to be put into perspective for Joan, and I wanted it to be kind of this just watershed moment that launches her on this journey, because it's such an extraordinary journey that I think there would have to be an equally extraordinary or powerful motivating force behind the actions that she chooses to take. And certainly, when you have something like that happen, it restores more agency to Joan than I think simply a saintly visitation would. Um, so I think in that sense, if you have something like Catherine's rape and subsequent her death follow, it just adds a more, it adds a human dimension to the book, one, and two, I think it's more interesting and effective than simply having Joan interact with saintly visions.
Yeah, absolutely. Without giving too much away, what happens immediately or relatively soon after Catherine's death? How does she happen to go on her journey?
Oh, I think it just signals the end of Joan's time in her home village.
Her
She
father
has
basically throws her out, right?
Right. So she
Yeah.
has nothing left to really stay for. And in a sense, she's lost everything. She's lost her ties to the uncle that she's adored, who's also left Dom Remy, and she's lost her sister, who was really her best friend. She's lost so much that she's cherished, and so she begins again from a blank slate. And so that was actually one of my favorite scenes in the book, now that I think about it, which is that when she leaves her village for the last time, um, I think I describe it as being almost akin to Saint Margaret's coming out of the belly of the dragon, who or the
Mm.
serpent, who represents Satan, and it's kind of a rebirth or coming up for air, and that's when your journey really begins. Um, so I was trying to draw that parallel between, the Joan of the novel, and also still, dropping hints here and there, signaling to her ties with Saint Margaret, which most people would know was a major historical element in her life.
Yeah. Um, Sticking with the family, you mentioned that her mother was very religious, but we don't hear very much about her mother throughout the novel. There is another strong female personality in Yolande, who is the mother-in-law of the Dauphin, as well as a queen in her own right. And she and Joan have a passing relationship, but a significant one, I think. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Um, Joan's relationship with Yolande.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both. It just represents different approaches to war. I think Joan has kind of the blinders on in terms of her stance, which is that it's always forward, forward onwards, the next battle, accumulating as many victories as possible, and it's just surging forward without really thinking too much of what goes behind the mechanics of war. And I think I wanted to demonstrate that in this respect, she has so much to learn. And one of the hardest lessons that she receives is, I think, when she meets Yolande, and she sees that how war is being funded and how it's paid. And I think almost that maybe because of the character of her mother in the novel, she has almost a kind of disparaging view of woman. Perhaps she thinks that, there's a kind of passivity or a lack or an inaction that she does not want to follow in her own life. And with Yolande, I think what Yolande demonstrates is a kind of almost political savvy or a strategy and an intelligence in that respect that Joan does not yet possess in terms of how to navigate the court, in terms of how to navigate the infrastructure of war versus just the moments of battle, which may be few and far between, especially in a war that's as extended as the Hundred Years' War. So I think I wanted to establish a kind of contrast between the two, but that they're also bonded and unified in this mutual cause. Um, so yeah, I think that was also a memorable scene for me in the book, which is when you see these women. I think it's Joan, Yolande, and the Dauphin's wife standing together. And what I like about that scene is that it's a quiet moment, but it's also a kind of extremely violent and bloodthirsty moment in its own way as well. Because they're talking about wanting the war to end basically through force and through blood. But it's just dialogue. There's no actual fighting taking place, but there's this pledge of violence. Also, through Yolanda, I think I wanted to demonstrate the PR machine that was happening behind Joan of Arc's character. Um, that when you have a figure like that in battle, and you have someone. I don't want to say a figurehead because she was very much a person of action as well. There's a lot that goes into building up the reputation and the kind of aura and the kind of awe that kind of that character inspires. And I think in the book, Yolande plays a heavy role in that as well.
I'd like to get back to the PR aspect, but before I do, it's Joan is physically big. She's capable of taking on most men. She has very short hair and wears men's clothing. Her appearance is confusing to some of those around her, especially her enemies, but she makes clear that she's a woman, not the same kind of a woman that Yolande is, but very much a woman. And you've got some wonderful passages about that in your book, and maybe you could paraphrase some of them about how she makes clear to everyone around her that she is, in fact, a woman.
Um, oh yeah, so there's this kind of, I think, weird exchange with a soldier where a bet seems to have been placed around what gender Joan is. And he says like, oh, we think you're a man, or possibly, whatever. He's being very immature about it, and he sort of taunts her. And I think Joan replies very seriously that she is a woman, and she sees no advantage either of being. So I'm paraphrasing, I guess. She sees no advantage of being a man. Um, she says, like, other than the physical attributes, I would have a pelt of hair on my chest, or things along those lines. She doesn't believe that she would have any other advantages, and so it's a very self-assured moment as well, where I think she's really beginning to come into her own and recognize her abilities. But there's also, a sense of egotism, and I would say it's bordering on arrogance. And that's obviously a theme that emerges again and again, especially later in the book as well. Um, I think with Joan's character too, for me, when I was writing her, she was almost an ideal character in a way. I think perhaps I was writing my ideal person, so my ideal woman. Um, Maybe because I was in such a vulnerable place in my life, having gone through not only job loss, but also after I'd written the very long draft of my novel, which was, as I mentioned, over 200,000 words. So it's basically almost like two books in one. and I'd done so much research. I was, I found out that I had cancer, um, not too long after finishing that first draft, and not too long after selling that draft to my editor. And then I decided to scrap everything and start from nothing. So I started with a blank page, and I think it was rewriting Joan, and she turned out to be such a different character in the second go round, so to speak. And I was probably writing my ideal person. And in many ways, she's still my ideal person because I think that, aside from, not just like physical strength, which to me doesn't mean very much, but in terms of just a kind of passion for life and a kind of, attitude towards others and a self-assuredness of knowing exactly who you are and your purpose and what you're meant to do in this world and how you're meant to exist and doing so much when you have so little time, and making such an impact. I think that is more what I wanted to sort of translate and say through this novel, than anything else.
You've mentioned prayer several times, at least a couple of times, and I was struck by, I think it's the Archbishop who asks, who talks about what men pray for: wealth, health, love, and he asks Joan what she prays for, and she says, "I pray for purpose," which I thought was extremely strong. Um, how else does Joan pray, or what is prayer or religion or God to Joan, to your Joan?
I think, it always surprises me when people have remarked that God is absent from the book or that religion is absent from the book, because that certainly wasn't my intention, especially having gone through, illness, which is always, no matter, maybe like, especially major illnesses, they're always a kind of test of faith. So faith was very much on my mind as I was writing, the second iteration of this novel. And so it was just a exercise for me in terms of how to insert faith and how to translate that faith and how to translate those visions in the book. I didn't want to make it so literal. And I think that, whether it's in film or whether it's in text, oftentimes subtlety is much more effective than being too on the nose. And so I seem to recall in the novel when Joan has an initial exchange with the Dauphin, he gives her a wafer as a kind of treat or as a kind of present because, he's the Dauphin. And so anything he gives is kind of a big deal. And he presents her with a wafer, and on it is stamped the image of Michael, the archangel, who has just slayed the serpent. I mean, that's an iconic image. And it was more like a moment like that is not only sort of tipping my hat at history, but it's also a way of heralding back to another moment in the book and tying it to, the something seemingly small, like the presence of cinnamon in the book. And that's also like a very evocative thing as an object, in the novel. So it's sort of tying the threads of Joan as she is when she meets the Dauphin, but also tying it back to her youth. Um, so it's trying to be a little more creative, I think, and trying to find a fresh approach to how to navigate religion and faith, in a way, especially with a character like Joan of Arc, where a lot of people know, the basic skeleton of her story already. Trying to find a different way into religion and faith, in the book that doesn't feel too blatant, and that also doesn't alienate, perhaps people of other faiths who might also have an interest in Joan, because I really do see her as a universal figure, at this point in time.
as she is.
Yeah.
Um, the relationship between Joan and the Dauphin, he needs her. Well, I'd like to just go back. So Joan couldn't save Guillaume. She couldn't save her sister. She couldn't save her beloved dog, whom her father killed. Why does she think she could save France, save the Dauphin?
I think in the novel, I was trying to draw a parallel between the Dauphin's character and Joan's character, in that they both undergo significant trauma in their early lives. And I wanted to show almost like two diverging paths that it's not that, their paths begin the same. That wouldn't be true at all. They come from different classes, the Dauphin is the Dauphin, and Joan is of peasant stock, so to speak. But I wanted to show that, but the Dauphin also has a share of, tragedy, and he's had missteps in his career. He's had unexpected things happen, like freak accidents happen in his life. He's been basically removed from inheriting the French throne. So, and he's sort of displaced. And I wanted to show, in a way, two characters that are displaced and how they deal with that trauma in different ways. And in that sense, I think Joan is, I mean, she's clearly the hero. So um, she's the sacrifice at the end of the novel. She's sacrificed to the enemy. Whereas I think I'm also making a point that perhaps in the long run, her lack of professionalism and her lack of political savvy and her lack of cunning and maybe her lack of cynicism is also what leads to her downfall. And these are things that the Dauphin's character possesses in abundance.
Mm. Um, she's the Dauphin to me comes across as a bit of a spoiled brat. Um, he fusses over very minor things. He is not a leader. There's a wonderful image where um, someone is reporting about a battle and how magnificently the king performed. He was out in front of his men. He encouraged them. He took care of the wounded. He was everywhere and doing everything the right way, the way a leader would be. And then, whoops, it's not the king at all. It's Joan at the leader in the middle of the
Oh
battle.
yeah.
Um, that she is the leader that he doesn't appear to be. Um, is that a correct assessment, or am I reading too much into his apparent powerlessness as he comes across in the
No,
novel?
I think that is a correct assessment, but I also think that there is something to be said about the fact that historically, at least, he did see the Hundred Years' War to, a victorious conclusion for France, whereas Joan was long dead by then. And what is that? 1453, when the Hundred Years' War ended, and Joan was dead in 1431. And it's just, I think there's something to be learned about how Joan's approach to life can burn out really quick, no pun intended. And whereas the Dauphin having a very different approach and sort of being almost double faced in many ways, um, is leads to his survival, especially in such a venomous environment like the court. So, and that's not a place where a character like Joan can reasonably expect to thrive in and to succeed in. I think, in a way, the novel's also suggesting that it's kind of a doomed journey to begin with, despite these victorious episodes. That there is something to be learned, I think, more broadly about human nature, from the way these two characters' paths overlap and then diverge, and one survives and the other doesn't. But the one who survives is not necessarily the stronger character, um, whether in terms of brute strength, physicality, or intelligence. But in the end, it's the Dauphin who lives and Joan who dies. Um, I mean, one could talk about longevity in history and how we remember those two characters, but in terms of just basic, years lived, it's a there's a clear victor between the two.
For sure. How does Joan change in the course of the novel?
I think she first. I think it's a big thing that she discovers her purpose in life. We talked about purpose earlier in the conversation. I think that plays a big role, which is that when you're born into the environment or the world that Joan is born, how on earth can you carve out a destiny other than the one that seems most obvious to you? And you kind of have a limited imagination in that sense, because how can you know of anything else beyond the world in which you are born unless you hear of it somehow? But with Joan, it's almost like the hand of destiny is guiding her, but also she has these inborn talents that are also a guide. And I think that's one thing. So, one, finding her purpose, and two, I think it's pretty evident from the beginning that Joan has a very tight knit circle of people she trusts and people she loves, um, without reservation. And she's also the kind of character who would, love without bounds. Like, she would do anything for her sister. She would do anything for her uncle. Um, and and in the end, I think she changes because her love transforms from a personal love to a more universal love of her fellow man or humanity. And it's a bigger, much bigger and more ennobling kind of love, which I think is demonstrated by the last scene in the book when the child throws the rock at Joan through the bars of the prison, and she literally turns the other cheek and she responds with kindness. And I don't know that she would have achieved such a kind of wisdom or a kind of like big-heartedness earlier on in the book, when she was fueled only by a sense of vengeance or anger or bitterness. But I think she moves beyond that. And also, like, going back to what we talked about with faith, I think her relationship with God changes a lot in the book. It's not that she ever doubts. I don't think it's doubt is the right word for her relationship with God early in the book, but I think there is a kind of a more ambivalent relationship, or almost a kind of maybe taunting relationship, or challenging relationship. And by the end, I think she has totally found her faith, because she's totally comfortable and at ease with who she is and what she believes is her destiny. And once she believes in that wholeheartedly, she doesn't have any doubts anymore. And it's almost like she comes fully into her own. Therefore, she is the closest that she has ever been in the book with God. So I think
But
she
it
in that respect as well.
but it's also a faith in herself. I
Yes,
see her as growing in confidence as the book goes on,
right.
and confidence, self-esteem. I wanted to say she's starting to believe her own press releases. Back to press, the idea of press relations, media relations. She's starting to believe what everybody is saying about her, that she's chosen by God, that she's this miraculous heroine, can do anything on the battlefield, particularly after Orleans, the victory at Orleans, and then she starts to believe, or to, in my reading, she really inhabits that belief that that is who she is, that is who she's become.
Yeah, I think there is an irony too with what you were mentioning, Anne, about believing what she is. In terms of, there's this PR machine behind her. There's all these mechanics that are building her up to be something greater or something transcendental. And the truth is, in fact, that she is in the novel transcendental. That she is, as I portray her, a kind of genius of warfare, that she's much more than a figurehead. She's much more than some kind of cheerleader for the soldiers on the sidelines. That she is this sort of literally a godsend that comes to France's aid at a pivotal moment. Um, and I think the irony is in that she is all these things, but also like how her own side and how the world decides to treat her, which is that, we all know that her fate ends being burned at the stake. So, um, I think it's also a comment on how we treat those who perhaps are ahead of our time or, you know, unique in a way or geniuses. I think it's also a kind of commentary on that.
Yeah. You had alluded earlier to the fact that not only is Joan a woman, which is one strike against her, but she's also a peasant. And some people at court just ignored her for that reason. She's not one of us. Um, but um, but she's still a leader. She's extremely eloquent. She's illiterate, but she's able to come up with these wonderful speeches leading men into battle, or interpreting the ways of the court, or just um, holding the head of a wounded enemy soldier. Um, how is this possible?
Yeah, I mean, I was also very surprised when I was researching Joan's life and history to read. I think they must have been transcripts of speeches that she made before battles, and I thought that they were extremely effective. And she would just repeat phrases over and over again, and it would be very very repetitive, but that wouldn't take away from the overall effectiveness of the speech itself. So, I mean, there are so many elements of her life that it's hard not to put a question mark on these things, such as, how did she learn to ride a war horse, which is very different than riding a regular horse. And, how was she able to do that? How was she able to wield a lance? Where did she learn that? Um, how was she able to know where to place artillery? There are sort of famous stories around not only her command of the troops, but there are often like lines about how, in terms of directing soldiers, it astonished the people around her, like how at ease she seemed to be. Um, and that maybe she was, more immature in other ways, but her presence on the battlefield and her way of commandeering everyone was, bar none. So there are all these intriguing questions that, for me, I tried to explore more at length in the book. Um,
Well, let's just talk briefly about craft, because we're getting to the end of our hour. One of the things that's interesting to me is that for a book of historical fiction, you've written it all in the present tense. How did you decide to do that?
I think the challenge with any work of historical fiction is how to make it feel relevant to a contemporary audience. So, and why should anyone care about Joan of Arc today? And what will even keep this book in print, or why should anyone publish it at all? Um, why should anyone care about this medieval, heroine from centuries and centuries ago? So I think the present tense obviously aids in that, but I think the most obvious connection with the present tense is, anyone who has read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel will know that that book is written in present tense, and how effective Mantel utilized present tense in her narrative of Thomas Cromwell. And so it's just so useful as a way to conjure a kind of immediacy in the narrative. But it's also like not everyone likes it. Some people find it a bit jarring, maybe because they're used to the past tense, or it's certainly a way to move the narrative along through this kind of shift. But it also creates, maybe, like, I would call it, invisible borders around how you write the story as well when you're using present tense. So it both liberates and it also confines in a way.
Was your first version, the 200,000 word version, also written in the present tense?
No, I think that was written in the past tense. I would have to check, but I would rather not, because I don't want to ever pull up that file again. The thing with that, the first draft, is that it was such, I just finished all this research on Joan of Arc, and what I did was I created separate Word documents of basically timelines and anecdotes that I'd accumulated from reading. And so there was, for instance, like a document on the Hundred Years' War during the time in which Joan lived, and then there was Joan's personal timeline, and then there were the timelines of other characters, and then I would just start pulling different stories and kind of elaborating on them. But I think the pitfall with the first draft is that it almost stuck too closely to history, which so it became a kind of dramatized biography in a way, which I think is incredibly boring to read, because why would anyone pick up a fictional biography when they could pick up an actual biography of Joan of Arc? That just doesn't make sense to me. So I think it's a very different thing to approach Joan's character from the vantage point of a historian versus a fiction writer. And your loyalties are to different things when you occupy one position as a historian or scholar versus as an author, a fiction writer, that is. So that was one thing that I learned while working on different iterations of the novel.
One of the things that I probably doesn't come across in this interview as well as it does in the book is the power of your prose. It's really quite beautiful. The dialogue is extraordinary. The characters are believable. The situations are riveting. The battle scenes, even the ones that are reported secondhand, are fascinating. Can you give us a reading of some kind, just to give our viewers a sense of your style, your prose?
Yes, and this would be a good place to end on as well, I think.
Okay.
So I'm only going to read two paragraphs from chapter 7 of the book, and it's the very end of one particular section when she's in dialogue with her uncle, and I think Joan wants to try to leave with him, but he's implying that it's not really a possibility for him to take her with him on his next um, on his future travels. So the section begins. She thinks she understands the purpose of the story, This must be what happens when you leave your home, travel, and see the world. Little by little, you begin to change, even if you are not aware of it. What was once alien becomes familiar. Foreign tongues, the music of strange instruments, the vagaries of the sea. Slowly you alter until the very stars that spin in the heavens are as familiar to you as the lines of your own hand. But first you must step out of your front door. You must leave behind what you know and possibly what you love. You must be willing to lose every inch of yourself. For the next time you look into a stream or a mirror, which may be weeks, years, or half a lifetime from now, you will not recognize your reflection. You must risk this much in order to gain what the world is ready to offer. They stand, brush themselves, and begin the long walk back to the village. It is another way of saying, no, you can't come. Another way of telling her you must make your own map of the world. Search out your own piece of sky and patch of earth, your own awning to sleep under when it is raining, and it feels the sun may never shine again, for there will certainly be such days. No one can walk this path for you. You cannot simply follow in another's footsteps, as though life were a complicated dance, every turn and twist memorized and prepared for ahead of time. There are many things in the world one can inherit: money, land, power, a crown. But an adventure is not one of them. You must make your own journey.
Well, this journey has been absolutely remarkable. Thank you very much for spending the time with us. I just have one more question. When we were looking for a title for our book group conversation, we came up with the idea of Joan of Arc, Saint or Sinner. We never actually came to a resolution, but what's your view, saint or sinner?
I was thinking of the title of the event, Saint or Sinner, and it occurred to me that it might be a sort of requisite of, maybe not in all cases, but maybe it's a requisite on some occasions, that you have to be a sinner first in order to become a saint. And that the idea of sinning is almost a rite of passage in ascending a kind of sainthood. And certainly that's true in some historical instances where you see people that we view as heroes now who were arrested and jailed, and then they become martyrs and saints to their community. So I was thinking, of the relationship between saint and sinner, and sort of contemplating how being a sinner um, may lead to sainthood in some extraordinary cases, such as with Joan of Arc. And certainly in her case, it's a very unusual and unique case where she was canonized almost 500 years after her death. And that's a very different situation than someone like Louis the Ninth. It was made into a saint, I think around, what, 3 decades after his death. So you have, Joan, who is such a controversial figure in a sense. She's so elusive, but also controversial. And her character is so, when you read her story, it's almost impossible to sidestep the space that she takes up in every narrative. Even though the Hundred Years' War, it lasted, I think, well over 100 years. So it was, I think, 116 years total. She's kind of like the hit single in that in the album of that war, which is a very trivial way of, talking about war, a very superficial way of talking about war. But it's her life story that stays with us. Um, and so it's her sainthood that's allowed her to endure as a universal figure, as such an iconic figure in our history. But it's also the more controversial, let's say the sinful elements of her character that I would say make her feel human in a way that other saints don't.
Well, thank you very much. That was a terrific answer, and I think saint sinner, but mostly a very human being. Thank you very much, Katherine Chen.
Oh, thank
Thanks to
you, Anne.
thanks to the Alliance Francaise of Metro Miami, and thanks to you, the viewers. We'll resume this book club and author interview in January. In the meanwhile, there'll be another book club in French starting November 12th. Please check the Alliance Francaise Metro Miami's website to learn more. Thank you all.